think doing the history of the slave trade is difficult and problematic for a lot of people who are interested in American history because it runs, its real history runs so counter to our myth of American history. So the myth of American history is one of a history of steadily broadening freedoms for more and more people. The history of the slave trade is the antithesis of that in many ways. And so one way to deal with the ways in which those two histories contradict one another is simply to ignore one of them. And the one of them that tends to be more ignored is the history of the slave trade. So that's the first step is recognizing that that myth of American history needs some attention. It needs some attention, and it needs attention from the slave trade, which was very much a part of it. So that's the first part. And though we didn't do this so much in the Institute, part of it in my teaching is having people to understand the ways in which the bondage of some was related to the growing liberty and freedoms of others. So that's the first step. The second step for the slave trade, what makes it difficult to recognize as a history, is because it's a trade and because the people in it, or we've come to understand quite well, I think, the ways in which they were commodified and dehumanized, and we've spent a lot of very good attention on capturing the scope of that dehumanization and its volume. We've spent less time and energy on capturing what the trade was as an experience, or as my colleague at the University of Washington, Stephanie Smallwood, would say, the social history of the slave trade. So part of what we did today is to try to, how do we go from where we are with the kind of commodity understanding of the slave trade? How can we use that to open up an understanding of the slave trade that lends a greater understanding of the experience of all the people that were involved in the slave trade? Because understanding the experience of the slaves opens up a view for white traders, for black traders, for sailors, for merchants in Liverpool and London, etc. Well, so with the transatlantic slave trade and the origins of Afro America, the first lecture I do is on the current state of the African diaspora. So I talk about African migration to the United States since 1965 and its volume and its vastness and how it has reshaped the nature of black identity in the United States and higher education and urban neighborhoods, et cetera, and how it rivals the scope of the slave trade to the present limits of the United States, to make the point that though we're about to study a time in the American past, small American, but also hemispheric American past, where the slave trade was vital and fundamental to the development of American economies and culture and society, we're actually living in a moment that is just as important. And some of the processes of cultural and social formation that result from that migration are similar, and the dynamics are similar. So I start with that, and then I also start in contemporary times with contemporary writers and thinkers wrestling with the question of the significance of the slave trade. And I do that so students can generate for themselves what they want to know, right? So if they've come to the class for reasons outside of, I really want to do 16 weeks on the slave trade, and most of them do come to the class for other reasons, I think it's important to give them some space to think about. After you've contextualized it for them, you give them an appreciation of what the African diaspora looks like now and why it's so important now. then they can think about what they want to know about the past. And these aren't issues that students have in a class about the civil rights movement, for example. They tend to have a better appreciation for how the civil rights movement informs or has informed their present life. It's not necessarily the case, with 15th and 16th century black migration to the Americas. One of the things I do talk about in class and sometimes just with students is what the ways in which African American history is kind of absent from the popular culture. What if we had better movies about the period of slavery in the Americas? What if we had, and people generally laugh at this, but what if we had better first-person shooters about the slave trade, about the perspective of the slave trade? Of course, it couldn't be a shooter, right? Because there weren't guns, or there were less guns. But parts of African American history is less gamified than other aspects of American history, and I think that's a way in which the present generation probably does a good deal of its memory or remembering of the past. I don't know, or I guess I'd be curious. Like, I'm excited by statues and statues coming down. But I imagine my kids are less excited about it because they didn't bother to look up and see the statue in the first place, and so maybe a little less excited. But they do listen to pop music, and they do watch TV, and they do get a sense of what should be important to them as Americans from that. And very little of that, I think, speaks to the slave trade or the enslaved experience in America in a really profound or subtle way. I would be very excited about an epic game that took on the full sweep of Afro American history. Or if it was a small company, we could figure out something smaller. But generationally, right? I can see a game that begins with the slave trade, right? And people have to make decisions under enormous constraints, right? And be able to see the impact or the effect of those decisions generationally. So what happens? What happens to a enslaved African who has some blacksmithing ability, who ends up as a smith on a plantation, and based on the choices he makes, how does that affect a family generationally? I could also see it. One of the most interesting books for me is All God's Dangers, the autobiography. I get his fake name and his real name mixed up. I think it's the autobiography of Nate Shaw or Ned Cobb. I forget. One of them is his real name. One of it's his fake name. It's called All God's Dangers because he says in the book, which is about the Jim Crow period, he says, all God's dangers ain't a white man, which I take to mean that, if you're interested in the Jim Crow period, you really got to be interested in a lot more than what you see as white oppression defining black life, but you've got to be interested in other things that are just, you got to know something about the boll weevil, which ain't white, it ain't black, it's a boll weevil, right? You've got to be interested in choices about companionship and recreation, etc., and how and about investing in a tractor or not investing in a tractor. And so this would be a wonderful game. I can guess at what some of their anxiety is, and one is it's hard, but a lot of history is hard. The other is that it's fraught and freighted with a study of the slave trade, sometimes cannot help but reflect upon problems of race in contemporary society that are difficult to discuss. And there's really nothing that can be done about that. We can choose to do what many folks have chose to do in the past because it was difficult, and that is simply to not do it, but that just perpetuates the problem. So I don't know, I think my number one encouragement is teachers know how to teach, right? Most teachers know how to teach. All good teachers know how to teach. And so there can really only be, good teachers can only be missing two things. And one of that is content, right? And the other is courage, right? And so I would just, and good teachers know how to be brave, even if they're not being brave in this area. So one bit of advice is be brave, right? Just do it. And the other thing is, in terms of content knowledge, is it's not rocket science, right? It is hard, but how to get, it's not hard to find out how to get smart about it. And so you've got to do what you have to do in terms of content knowledge for any field, and that is you have to read, and you have to read around, and you have to discuss with your colleagues. And I think it is something that's done best in a collegial fashion. But I know that my son and daughters are taught a lot of math that doesn't necessarily make sense to them when they learn it. Sometimes they get the answer, but I don't know that they get the math. And so I think it's okay for good teachers to push ahead on things that their students may not be fully ready for or can't appreciate, because then it is the planting of a seed. It is the beginning of an education that hopefully continues. I would encourage it, but also with a warning, right? So reading the late 18th century letter of a slave trader back to his boss in Liverpool is, in terms of simple reading, it's not too difficult. I mean, it's troublesome, right? But people can read it. But in terms of understanding, people need, and students need a decent framework, and I think a good deal of help. So I would encourage it, but a really good primary source takes a whole lot of contextualization, and giving the letters we wrote, just passing them out to students and kind of working through them without a decent amount of pre-work is probably not going to be very helpful. If I want to learn something that I don't know and you know it, you're going to have to, it'd be good if you would teach it to me, right? I think teaching is really, really important. Like the actual act of teaching, not making room for people to learn. That's good too. Do that, right? Making room for people to explore. That's good. But what's really good is teaching in a bunch of different ways to help people come to an appreciation for a subject.